Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. So today we have a very special show on the current geopolitics in the world and why de-dollarization is picking up. And we'll go into some internal reasons. You already heard the show of Dr. Ankit Shah. There is a whole playlist of Dr. Ankit Shah which you can watch on our channel. And he has done a very detailed analysis. But on the current happenings, we have a very special guest, Carpentier, and we will discuss with him what is going on. Welcome, Com.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Nice to be back.
So, Com, like in your view, because you are a French journalist based out of India, and I think you know more about India than anyone else. And also you are part of the India Foundation, which is a very premium think tank. Think tank, I always say that in Hindi we say soch ka kua.
Yes, well, literal translation. You could also call it Chua Vahana, right? Because the tank is also a vehicle. So, or, yeah.
Okay, and English is a funny language, so the literal translations don't work. Anyway, so the today's scenario where we were discussing yesterday evening that Victoria Nuland gave a very bloody nose to USA, not to Russia or any other country. Bloody nose to USA, where everyone is talking about the de-dollarization, which has happened in the now we are seeing that happening through the BRICS and other countries. So, what did USA gain by all these things?
I wrote today a paper on how the US clearly is responsible for many of its problems at home and in the world because of its generally misconceived, aggressive, and belligerent policies, which aim at preserving and bolstering its supremacy. And many very acute observers of the contemporary scene in the US have written and spoken about this, including Jeffrey Sachs. And I could quote several others, Robert Kennedy Jr., who is running for president, and so on and so forth. The list is long. But the fact is that neoconservatism in its geopolitical interpretation has been as harmful as neoliberalism with its woke extension to the US, both in its social and economic health, as well as in its standing and in its power in the world. So we are seeing the effects of those very ill-conceived and nefarious policies. And as you see, there is an increasing number of articles which now confess that the US and NATO are losing the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is gradually collapsing. And I even saw today that one of the tribunals in Ukraine is now investigating Zelensky for high treason. This shows the enormous amount of internal conflict erupting within Ukraine and the rival power gangs, basically, which are fighting for somehow trying to take control of whatever is left of Ukraine. Because now Zelensky is going to be held responsible for the terrible disaster that he has inflicted on his country under American, British, and generally speaking, NATO prodding.
See, one of the very poor decision making by the Ukrainians on many fronts, in terms of economics, and in terms of especially military help. Do you think the Ukraine's bid to join NATO will be successful, according to you?
Well, it now looks like it would be for NATO an extremely risky gamble to accede to Ukraine's demand, because not only would it be extremely costly, it has already cost hundreds of billions, so it's becoming a fiasco that may be as big as Afghanistan. But beyond that, of course, now the US is faced with the terrible predicament of not knowing how to back down and still keep face. And the same is true of the NATO decision makers and of the Europeans who have followed rather sheepishly the American lead and now have to face the consequences. It is true that in real fact, NATO is already a part of, I meant Ukraine is already a part of NATO, because it has gotten all the support and backing that it can get. And there was a news item yesterday to the effect that NATO and the European Union together have agreed that an additional amount of money of several hundred million to begin with will be dedicated to producing weapons and ammunitions for Ukraine. And more interestingly, even, that part of that money would be taken from the social budget, which means that money which was supposed to be allocated to healthcare, education, scientific research will now go to providing weapons to Ukraine, even though there is less clarity about who exactly will man those weapons, because unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainian soldiers are dead or out of commission, and there is no clear replacement for them.
See, from the perspective of Europeans, if you look at Europeans, how do the Europeans view this war today with Ukraine and Russia?
Europeans are always divided about this as about many other things, so you cannot talk about a European viewpoint. You have to distinguish between the elites, the privileged upper class, and the average person. The average person may or may not feel sympathy for Ukrainians. Most of them would feel sympathy for Ukrainians, but they don't necessarily feel sympathy for Ukraine's policies as a state, because everybody with a little bit of good sense sees that Ukraine should and could have avoided this massacre by simply being realistic. In other words, making a deal with Russia, agreeing to follow the Minsk agreements, and therefore avoiding total destruction of its army and of its infrastructure. Now, beyond that, a lot of Europeans are afraid of Russia. They are obviously very hostile to Putin because of what they see every day in the news. And they feel that Putin is a conqueror who wants to enslave Europe like Hitler. But that is only a part of the population. Another portion, which I do not quantify because I don't know really how many people are well informed and how many people think for themselves. But the fact is that a lot of people, both on the left and on the right, particularly on what you might call the hard right, are not at all hostile to Russia and Putin and feel that Russia had to react, even though it may not have reacted in the best way, but it had to react to a NATO encirclement, which was very blatant. I mean, NATO made no mystery of its intention to ring Russia with military bases and allied states. And that was the reason why, after many years of warning and arguing, Russia decided to take military action. Now, nobody likes war, well, some people do because they make money from it. And unfortunately, lots of other people also like to fight. This is an old human trait. But the fact is that a lot of what has happened was primarily due to the Western and especially the American attempt to encircle Russia as a first step towards what they call the Great Eurasian Conflict, which would consist in bringing down Russia and China, which are seen as the greatest threats to the US-dominated world order. And if I have to go into a very contemporary situation, I would point out to what's happening now with the next BRICS meeting, which is to take place in August in South Africa. That is a summit to be attended by the 5 BRICS heads of state, and they are supposed to include in BRICS, on the occasion of that summit, about 8 to 10 other countries, maybe only 4 or 5 to begin with, but 10 are on the waiting list and maybe more. Now, that to Washington is extremely unpleasant and is to be avoided at all costs. Furthermore, the BRICS summit is supposed to announce formally that a new BRICS common currency will be deployed. We don't know the time frame. These things take some time to come to fruition, but the intention and the strategy are clearly there. And that is a very, very bad news for the US dollar dominance in world trade. So the US has to react to try to block that summit and make it essentially deviate from its objective. And what you have, of course, very opportunely is an arrest warrant against President Putin, which has been signed by a judge at the International Court of The Hague. Now, if you go into the background, which I do in my recent article, not yet published, but I am only quoting published sources, so I'm not making anything up, is that judge apparently was compromised because of a family issue. I won't go into that further, but you can read the name of the judge in the news media, Karim Khan, and it's possible or even highly likely that he was influenced, let's put it this way, to issue that warrant of arrest on the basis of purely testimonies collected in Ukraine, which is a belligerent state and which cannot therefore be held as an impartial source of information. Now, what is the point of this? Well, very clearly, they are trying to warn South Africa. In fact, they have put South Africa on notice that if they do not arrest Putin when he comes to the summit, then South Africa will be held liable and there will be heavy price to pay. Sanctions and whatever else they can conjure up. So obviously it's a big problem for BRICS, just like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, which was to be held in India, is now to be taking place virtually. We don't know the reason, but there is a good likelihood that this was decided jointly because of the problem that once Putin was scheduled to come to India, then there would be huge pressure on India to also do something about it, because even though India hasn't signed on the International Criminal Court, by the way, neither has the US and neither has Russia, none of the strict states are ratified, but South Africa has. So technically, South Africa is obliged to arrest him, although South Africa can invoke the diplomatic immunity conferred to heads of state, but of course, the US and Britain and their allies will have none of it and say, no, it doesn't matter. You have to arrest him because we tell you so. So obviously, this is posing a problem. And the major reason, forget about the moralistic reasons which are always invoked. But the fact is that it's all about crushing that BRICS progress and warning BRICS that they cannot go in that direction, because that is like a sort of a declaration of war on the US-ruled global monetary system.
US ruled world order.
Exactly. Rules-based world order.
Rules-based world order. Who makes the rules? We all know.
You obey them. Yeah, right.
Is it possible that they can create a commando-style operation or some kind of a military operation to arrest Putin and his plane, because Putin is far away from Russia? Is it possible or not?
It seems very difficult because Russia is a nuclear armed power and the consequences could be unpredictable. If Russia hits back in any way, then you could have a world war, which is already we are on the brink of in Ukraine for the last few months. So I doubt that anybody would be as insane as that to try, especially since the US military and NATO would certainly not want to try that. What could be happening, although it's a remote possibility, is that if Putin's plane overflies a territory which is under the direct control of the rules-based world order, they could technically order his plane to land, but obviously his plane will be escorted by military planes, so I doubt that any such order would be obeyed. So this is all very hypothetical. And honestly, I think that as long as Putin stays away from unsafe countries, his not going to be heard. I mean, we all know that Senator Lindsey Graham has openly talked about the desirability of assassinating Putin. But of course, the US government cannot officially endorse that, even though there have been allegations that they have tried. But, I'm not necessarily believing those allegations. So we are in a situation where, remember, there was a time when Kissinger was under a warrant of arrest issued by Judge Garzón, the same Spanish judge who had gotten Pinochet to be arrested in Britain. However, Pinochet was a former head of state. So the protection conferred to him was no longer really there. But we all remember that Kissinger, for many months, avoided flying over Europe because he was afraid that he could be arrested. And therefore, he stayed in safe territory until somehow the threat was lifted. So I guess Putin will also, it's an interesting question whether Putin would take the risk, although it should not be a risk to go to South Africa. Or we also understand that South Africa has actually been discussing with China about China actually hosting the summit, because that would relieve South Africa of any liability. And China certainly would not mind the US threats. It has already got a lot of them, and China can handle them. So that may be an option. The other option would be for South Africa to get out from the International Criminal Court, therefore resign its membership. And in that situation, South Africa would certainly have no legal reason to arrest Putin. But clearly, no Russian delegation will go to South Africa until there is an absolutely clear guarantee that he and his delegation would not be under any kind of threat.
We are in the world. It's very interesting to watch geopolitics nowadays, because we see everything is like happening like a movie, open threats and open nuclear threats going on, flying on all sides. And American bases are all over Africa, and Diego Garcia. And so it will be very difficult to fly undetected. I think that China will be a very safe option. But coming to Lindsey Graham, you can easily compare him to Lalu Prasad Yadav of India, because both have the equal amount of credibility, and both of them are known to speak before thinking. And that's how he's viewed in the USA. I don't know why people take him seriously. And also Victoria Nuland also has a similar amount of credibility in the US, because she's known as a warmonger. But unfortunately, these are the people who are making the noises in the media, unfortunately. Now, I do not know how much sensible American policymakers are to continue to degrade USA continuously by making these statements, as well as actions. Actions are more than $600 billion of Russia were seized. So do you think that the ICC, International Criminal Court, or ICJ, how relevant is that institution, provided US has not ratified, India has not ratified, Russia has not ratified? I don't know about China.
No, China has not ratified either. They would never ratify, because it was very clear to, let's put it this way, to other powers that this was all meant to be an instrument for Western law enforcement. It's like most of the heads of state who have been tried are African, and except for Yugoslavia. Again, Yugoslavia was in fact close to the Soviet Union and then to Russia, so it was fair game. But other than that, any head of state who is considered to be an ally, between inverted commas, of the West is reasonably safe, unless he really turns against them. I would be worried if I were President Viktor Orban of Hungary, because he's obviously cocking his nose at the US and at the European Union. But he has strong support among Republicans in the US. He was a good friend of President Trump, so the US would probably be of two minds about him. But in the EU, he has become public enemy number 2 after Putin. So clearly, these kind of divisions are there, and they are increasing. And the US is trying in all sorts of ways, including very awkward ones, to show that it's still the boss and it can rule the roost. But this isn't really working. And I think the very state of in body and mind of President Biden is a symbol of what's happening to the US. You know, there is clearly decay that has set in, and it's in a very advanced stage.
Coming to the last question, Europe's largest economy, Germany, is in recession today. So how does it impact Europe's prosperity? Because and the countries like Spain and Portugal, I never hear of them in any part of economic thing or something. They are happy in still getting revenues from their colonies in South America, I believe.
Well, you certainly wouldn't see that if you are part of the average Spanish population. I mean, there may be, of course, there are business elites which are international and they collect revenues from many different parts of the world. But in general, Spain, Italy, and other Southern European countries are steadily getting impoverished. They are losing their living standards when you're talking about the lower middle class and the middle class as such. I mean, what you see everywhere, including America, is happening there. You know, the very rich are doing very well, or at least they are keeping, by and large, their assets. But anyone below them is severely affected, and it's getting worse. And that's why you see a shift to the right in many of those.
I think we lost him.
Their trust in the left because they realize the left is woke, but it's not doing anything for the poor anymore. The left is just interested in making sure. I mean, the left is all about LGBTX and some vague talk about green energy and electric cars and reducing pollution. But other than that, they are really not doing anything to solve economic problems, and they are generally making them a lot worse. So people tend to put their faith in the right, which pledges to protect the nation state from the EU's encroachment, and which also generally tries to give priority to the local population, which is now the great concern because most people realize that any foreign cause, whether it's immigrants or Ukrainians, is getting priority over the local population. In other words, even countries that cannot adequately feed and support their own population, they are throwing billions at in Africa or at African newcomers and at Ukrainians and you name it. And any kind of welfare or human rights cause in South America or South Asia gets support from the states. And they don't really ask for any permission from their own citizens. They just do what they want with the money that they're entrusted with.
This is this is the last question, that why the West or rules-based West, which is the headquarters of the West is in Washington, D.C., is always insecure, or who always thinks that the world is getting out of their control, and world was never in their control. It's like 7.5 billion people of the earth. How they think in their mindset that they need to follow their rules.
Well, remember, I would say a big part of the world was and still is under their control. I mean, if you look at the way things are done, you realize how much power the US and a few other countries have. Usually this changing because of the rapid enrichment and the rapid rise of countries like China, India, Iran, and many other states, and the fact that Saudi Arabia and other oil producers are also getting away from the US, being US protectorates. So the slow, gradual decline of the British Empire, which was replaced by the American Empire, that is now coming to a head. And it's natural that they feel worried because they did have an enormous amount of control and they see it eroding steadily. And, I remember that I would say, very perceptive statement by Craig Calhoun, who is an American intellectual with whom I had a conversation. And Professor Calhoun said, and this was like 12 years ago, he said, the US is going to decline in a very ungraceful way. it was an understated way of putting it. But the fact is that by declining, the US is losing all its attempts at being decent and is now behaving, frankly, like a bully by using openly blackmail and, of course, whenever it can, seduction. But very quickly, the blackmail takes over. And that's what's happening. And it's a reality that everybody can witness. And that is part of the frustration of losing power and not being able to offer so many benefits as they did in the past to their proteges. Now they just have to openly threaten them and say, if you don't do what we tell you, we're going to put you under, some sort of, in the doghouse. And remember, the number of countries which are under US unilateral sanctions is growing. Every year you have more countries which are being punished for something that they did or didn't do or would do or might do. That goes on all the time. And many American observers, including John Mersheimer, are noticing that. And again, I'm talking about observers who are both conservative on the right and left or even far left. But they tell you the same thing. They say it's amazing to see how much the establishment is now estranged from both the left and the right.
And they blame it on wokeism, but we all know the wokeism was first practiced by the church itself on the natives. Cancel the culture. This happened in the past.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you had the religion of certain kind of morality, whether it was puritanical or otherwise. Now it's what you might call a cult of homosexuality, transgender, all sorts of bizarre things, which may concern very, very few individuals because of some mishap at birth. But now it's being made into some sort of a fashion and even an imposition, and major companies are being pressured. You have to produce transgender clothes for children, and you have to put them in your stores and make sure everybody sees them. This is completely abnormal. Nobody is asking for this. This is just a systematic attempt which is being pushed from the top.
Yeah, US Vice President Kamala Harris, it actually threatened Uganda with sanctions if they don't put this law in practice. And
well, Biden did the same. And, it's obvious Biden wouldn't even remember Uganda if he were briefed about it 2 minutes before. But the fact is that these people are now under pressure to perform, and that's why in the West, people tend to laugh at the antics of Biden and Kamala Harris, But then it's interesting, if you read the Russian and the Chinese press, they never laugh about them. They say, those people may behave like clowns, but it doesn't make them any less dangerous because they are being manipulated by certain forces which have an agenda. And whether Biden forgets or falls on the ground and can't get up, and that doesn't affect the policies that the state practices. And that's why when the West and many Americans feel, look at what president we have, how can he get anything done? Well, he may not get anything done, at least not to his knowledge, but there are people behind him who are carrying on with the agenda.
So do you think the Hollywood culture has taken over the American policymakers in the rules-based order?
There is certainly a major emphasis nowadays on perception rather than reality. As long as they feel something is made perceptible in a certain way, then they don't care so much about the reality of it. That's why they are desperate to project an image that Russia has been defeated and Ukraine is winning. And obviously that's the contrary of reality, but it's still being pushed in the media in the West. And you still have commentators on French or English TV who are explaining to you gravely how the Russians can fight and how they are doomed and how Ukrainians have done such a great job. And yet, Ukraine has lost 25% of its territory. Most of its government control centers have been destroyed. And half of the Ukrainians are living abroad. And yet, supposedly, Ukraine is winning, so...
if viewers want to watch a future, because many of the Hollywood movies are built on novels and predictions of many novels, there's a movie called Idiocracy. Do watch it. And how it is dumbing the population. Do watch that movie, Idiocracy. And my friend recommended, it's not, I won't advise to, watch it for education only and watch it alone, not with the children, because the language is very indecent, which I don't approve at all. But anyway, that's the way American society works. So, and that's where it is going towards. Anyway, thank you, Ko. Yeah.
There is an old movie called Wagging the Dog, which was very interesting. And it was made at the time of the Iraq War. And it really shows in a very, of course, satirical way how this war was conducted.
Literally. I mean, anyway, I mean, do watch these movies, and sometimes you'll get a glimpse of what they're trying to show. And we also discussed in one other show also that many of these movies are pretty accurate on what's happening. And they predicted long back before things happened. And somehow the novelist or whoever was writing it got some inspiration from some factual data before creating a fiction. So do watch it. Thank you so much, Kom, Kapote, and for all the viewers watching. Do like, share, subscribe. Let us know your feedback. Namaste.